They taught you to watch this movie as a love story. And it is one of the most devastating acts of historical erasure ever disguised as children's entertainment. Pocahontas, released in 1995, is not the most beautiful film Disney ever made. It is the darkest. Not because of what it shows you, but because of everything it deliberately hides beneath the music, beneath the colors, beneath the romance. What they buried underneath all of that is the documented beginning of a genocide. And the love story is the mechanism they used to make sure you never felt the full weight of what was actually happening on that screen. Today, we are pulling back the curtain, not with anger for its own sake, but with something more unsettling than anger, with clarity. Because when you understand what this film is actually about, you cannot unsee it. You will never be able to look at that final shot of Pocahontas standing on the cliff, watching the ship disappear into the horizon, the same way again. Because that image, that gorgeous, emotional, cinematically perfect image, is not a farewell between two people who love each other. It is a young woman watching the beginning of the end of her entire world. Let's start from the very first frame. Everything in this movie begins with ships. 3 English vessels crossing the Atlantic, full of armed men, heading toward a land that already belonged to someone else. And this is where the film makes its first and most important deception. It frames the arrival of those ships as excitement, as adventure, as the beginning of something wonderful. The music swells, the men sing, and for a few beautiful animated minutes, you are made to feel the thrill of exploration, the romance of a voyage towards something new. But think about what that framing is actually doing to your brain in real time. It is conditioning you, before a single plot point has been established, to root for these men, to feel their journey as your journey, to experience their arrival as a beginning, when for the people already living on that land, the sight of those sails on the horizon was not a beginning. It was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen. The film calls it a new world, and that phrase alone deserves to be taken apart, slowly, and examined piece by piece, because there was nothing new about it. It was only new to the people arriving. The land had been fully inhabited, fully understood, fully mapped in its own way, by its own people for thousands of years before a single European ship ever entered those waters. Calling it a new world is not a neutral geographic description. It is the first act of erasure, the verbal equivalent of drawing a blank on a map where there are already cities, trade routes, laws, governments, and living human beings. And most American kids grew up knowing exactly that framing, not just from Disney, but from school, from textbooks, from the whole mythology of discovery that gets taught every November around a holiday specifically designed to sanitize this exact same history. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And Pocahontas fits perfectly inside that pattern because it was built for exactly the same purpose. Now, let me tell you about the world that was already there before those ships arrived, because the film skips almost entirely over this part. And what gets skipped is everything that matters. The people Pocahontas belongs to in this film were part of what historians call the Powhatan Confederacy. Not a loose collection of wandering bands of people, but a sophisticated political alliance of more than 30 distinct tribes, all living under a unified leadership structure governed by a paramount chief whose territory spanned a massive portion of what is now the state of Virginia. This was not a small settlement. This was an organized civilization with its own diplomatic protocols, its own trade networks, its own agricultural systems. They grew corn, beans, and squash in rotation, a technique so advanced that European settlers would eventually depend entirely on it for their own survival. They had a profound, detailed understanding of every river, every season, every ecosystem within their territory. They had laws, they had courts of justice, they had a system for handling conflict between member tribes. They had relationships with neighboring nations that stretched back generations. They were not waiting for someone to come along and teach them how to live. They already knew exactly how to live, because this was their home, and it had been their home for longer than England had been a country. But none of that is in the movie. In the movie, the indigenous people are presented as part of the landscape, as beautiful and elemental as the rivers and the wind and the talking willow tree. They are shown as spiritual and connected to nature, which they were, but they are not shown as the sophisticated political civilization they actually were. because showing them as a fully developed civilization would make what happens next impossible to romanticize. You cannot frame an invasion as an adventure if the audience already understands that the people being invaded have their own complex society with everything to lose. So the film keeps them just vague enough, just elemental enough, that when the conflict starts, it can still feel like a misunderstanding between two roughly equal groups of people who just need to learn to understand each other, rather than what it actually was, which was a heavily armed colonial enterprise deliberately dismantling a functioning civilization in order to take its land. Now let me talk about the man the film presents as its villain, because Governor Ratcliffe is one of the most cleverly misused villains in Disney history, and understanding why reveals one of the most important lies this film tells. The movie gives you Ratcliffe as your villain so that you will stop looking for the real one. He is pompous, he is greedy, he is ridiculous, he has a pampered pet dog, and an obsession with gold that borders on parody. He is designed carefully and deliberately to be the kind of villain you can dismiss, the kind where you sit there thinking, well, if it weren't for this one ridiculous man, everything would have been fine. But history does not work that way. And what Ratcliffe actually represents is something far more dangerous than a single greedy individual, because single greedy individuals can be stopped. What Ratcliffe represents is a system, a machine, an entire economic and ideological structure that had been running for generations before he ever stepped onto that ship, and that would continue running for generations after he was carried off it. Here is the detail the film never tells you, and that changes everything about how you read Ratcliffe. That expedition was not funded by the English crown directly. It was funded by a private corporation called the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise where wealthy investors in London had pooled their money to finance colonization in exchange for a return on their investment. Those men coming off the ship were not just soldiers carrying a flag. They were, in a very real sense, employees. Employees whose job was to generate profit for shareholders sitting safely across an ocean, far from any of the consequences of how that profit was generated. This is not a small historical footnote. It means the violence of that colonization was not just the result of personal hatred or individual racism, though both of those things were absolutely present. It was also structural. It was economic. It was the logical output of a business model in which the land was the inventory, the resources were the product, and the people who already lived there were treated, in the coldest possible boardroom terms, as an obstacle to be managed, removed, or eliminated. Ratcliffe is not just a greedy man. Ratcliffe is what it looks like when an entire system of extraction, backed by capital and justified by ideology, sends a representative to do its work. And the terrifying thing about that is not Ratcliffe himself. The terrifying thing is that when Ratcliffe gets arrested and put on a ship back to England at the end of the film, the system does not get arrested with him. The system stays. The system keeps growing. The system sends the next ship, and the ship after that, and the one after that. That is the first layer of the tragedy this film buries under a love story. Now let's get to the second layer. And this one is the cruelest of all, because it is hidden inside the most beautiful thing the film offers you. Before we get there, let me take a second to acknowledge something. This kind of video takes a significant amount of research, a significant amount of time, and it only exists because people choose to support it. If you have been watching this, and something is clicking into place for you, something you had never quite seen before about a film you grew up with, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment down below and tell me honestly, did you always see Pocahontas as an innocent love story? Or was some part of you always uncomfortable with something you could not quite name? And subscribe to Animation Files so you are here for every one of these deconstructions, because this film is just one of many we have taken apart. Now, John Smith. I know what you were thinking. John Smith is the good guy. He is the one who learns, who listens, who falls genuinely in love, who literally takes a bullet for the chief at the end. He is the anti-Ratcliffe, the proof that not all colonizers were monsters, the romantic hero who makes the whole film work emotionally. And that is exactly why he is the most dangerous character in the entire film. Not because he is a bad person. He may not be, but because his goodness, or at least the appearance of it, is precisely the mechanism through which the most destructive thing in the film happens. John Smith is not just a love interest. John Smith is a Trojan horse. Think about what the situation actually is when he arrives. An armed colonial force has landed on indigenous territory. They are building a fort. They are digging up the earth looking for gold. They are cutting down trees. They are, by their very presence, making an implicit claim of ownership over land that is not theirs. The natural, rational, understandable response from the people whose land this is would be defense, resistance, and in fact, that is exactly what the film shows you building on both sides. Both camps are preparing for war. And then, right at the exact moment when that conflict is about to reach its breaking point, a love story starts. And that love story does something that no amount of military force could have accomplished on its own. It gets Pocahontas, the daughter of the paramount chief, to lower her guard, to become a bridge, to use her own standing within her community to argue for peace and trust with the very people who are occupying her land. John Smith does not need to convince an entire nation. He only needs to convince one person, the right person, the person whose voice carries enough weight to stop a war. And once he has convinced her, once she has crossed the line and chosen him, he has achieved something with a smile and a canoe ride that armies would have needed months of fighting to accomplish. This is the Trojan horse pattern in its purest form. Not an enemy who enters through force, but a presence that gets invited in, that gets trusted, that lowers every defense from the inside. The Greeks did not smash through the walls of Troy. They got Troy to open the gates willingly, to drag the horse in themselves, to celebrate what they thought was a gift. And by morning, everything was gone. John Smith is that gift, and Pocahontas is the one who opens the gates. Now, I want to be careful here, because this framing can make it sound like I am blaming her, and I am absolutely not. What happened to her is not her fault. It is not a failure of judgment on her part. It is what happens when you put a real human being with real feelings in the middle of a structural dynamic that is far bigger than any individual choice she could make. She falls in love. That is real. Her feelings are real. But real feelings do not change what the arrival of that ship actually means for her people, no matter how sincere the man who came off it turns out to be. Because the problem was never John Smith's character. The problem was what came with him and what would follow after him, whether he intended it or not. The first thing that came with those ships, before any weapon was ever raised, was disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, respiratory infections that European bodies had spent generations developing partial resistance to, through centuries of exposure and adaptation. Diseases that indigenous bodies had never encountered in the history of their existence on this continent. Diseases that had no treatment, no cure, no defense, because you cannot develop immunity to something you have never been exposed to. What those diseases did to the indigenous population of the Americas is one of the most staggering demographic catastrophes in the history of the human species. Historians estimate that somewhere between 70 and 90% of the pre-contact indigenous population of the Americas died from introduced disease within the first few generations of European contact. Not from warfare, not from slavery, though both of those were devastating in their own right. The single largest cause of death was the invisible thing that arrived in the bodies of people who seemed perfectly healthy, who came smiling and offering gifts and asking to sit down together. Take a moment and think about what 70 to 90% actually means. It means that for every 10 people living in a community, 7, 8, 9 of them are gone within a generation. It means elders who hold centuries of accumulated knowledge dying before they can pass it on. It means children dying before they have learned the language properly. It means entire villages emptied before a single soldier ever arrives, before a single fort is ever built in their vicinity. The disease moves faster than any army, faster than any news, faster than any warning could travel from one community to the next. And it enters through the exact same door as friendship, through the first handshake, the first shared meal, the first embrace between two people who genuinely, sincerely like each other. The most lethal thing those colonizers brought with them was not the guns. It was not the swords. It was the simple biological fact of their presence. Then came the weapons themselves. The muskets, the cannon, the gunpowder, military technology that represented centuries of European investment in the science of killing, refined through wars against other Europeans, and now deployed in an environment where the defending population had no equivalent. Every decade that passed, the technological gap grew wider. Every year, more ships arrived carrying newer weapons, and every generation of indigenous resistance found itself fighting with less land, fewer people, against more firepower than the generation before it had faced. And then came the most insidious thing of all, the precedent. Because once one group of colonizers manages to stay, once one fort gets built and holds its ground, once one winter passes and the colony is still there in the spring, it establishes something that changes the entire calculation for everyone who comes after. It proves the route works. It proves the land is accessible. It proves that settlement is possible, and that information travels back across the ocean and becomes the reason the next ship is sent, and the one after that, and the dozens of ships after that. This is what the movie does not and cannot show you while it is trying to sell you a romance. Pocahontas is the story of first contact, but first contact is only the opening sentence of a paragraph that goes on for hundreds of years and ends in a way that no Disney soundtrack could ever be composed to accompany. And here is something that sits underneath the entire film that never gets addressed directly, but that changes everything about how you should interpret every single scene of romance. The Pocahontas depicted in the movie, the tall, graceful, fully adult woman with the flowing hair and the confident voice and the romantic feelings, is not who the real person was at the time of these events. The historical Pocahontas, the actual human being who lived and breathed and grew up in that specific place at that specific time, was approximately 10 to 12 years old when she first encountered John Smith and the Jamestown settlers. 10 to 12 years old. That is a child. That is not a young woman falling in love. That is a child navigating an incomprehensibly dangerous situation that adults many times her age did not fully understand. Disney aged her up deliberately, gave her an adult body, an adult emotional life, and an adult romantic arc, because the alternative was either to tell the story honestly, which would make the romance impossible, or to not tell the story at all. They chose the version that sells. They chose the version that keeps the love story intact. And in doing so, they committed the same fundamental act of revision that colonizers committed throughout history, rewriting who indigenous people actually were in order to make their own story more comfortable to tell. This is not an isolated creative decision. This is a pattern. This is what happens when the entertainment industry reaches into history and selects which parts to keep and which parts to discard based on what will play best in a multiplex on a Friday night. The parts that get discarded are always the parts that would make the dominant culture uncomfortable. The parts that stay are always the parts that allow the dominant culture to see itself as, at worst, flawed, but ultimately good. Now let's talk about the ending, because the ending of this film is where the deception reaches its most sophisticated and most heartbreaking form. The climax builds to a confrontation. Ratcliffe wants war, wants to kill the chief, wants to take the land and the gold, and be done with negotiating. Pocahontas throws herself over her father's body, uses her love as a literal shield, and somehow, through the sheer emotional power of the moment, stops the war before it starts. Ratcliffe fires anyway, hits John Smith instead, gets restrained by his own men, gets clapped in irons and shipped back to England as a prisoner. John Smith, wounded, has to board the ship to receive medical treatment back in England. Pocahontas chooses to stay with her people rather than go with him. And then comes that final shot, the one they built the entire film toward. Pocahontas on the cliff, hair and dress caught in the wind, looking out at the ship growing smaller on the horizon, the music rising, the colors golden, every element of the frame designed to feel like hope, like love, like a bittersweet but ultimately meaningful ending. And it is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the history of American cinema, not because of what is in it, but because of what it is hiding. Look at what actually happened in that scene, stripped of the music and the cinematography. An English colonial vessel, full of armed men, with a fully established fort already built on indigenous land, is leaving temporarily because its commanding officer did an obviously criminal thing and the crew refused to follow him into it. That is all that happened. The men did not renounce their claim to the land. They did not dismantle the fort. They did not agree to leave permanently. They did not sign any treaty, make any promise, or accept any new terms of engagement. They just left. For now. And the fort is still standing when they go. That fort is the most important object in the entire film, and the film almost never draws your attention to it, because that fort is the proof that this was never meant to be a visit. It was meant to be a settlement, and the ships that left will come back, because the whole business model, the entire Virginia Company investment, depends on the colony either succeeding or being abandoned and written off as a loss. There is no version of what is happening in this film where those men sail away and simply decide not to come back. When Pocahontas watches that ship disappear over the horizon, she is not watching a danger pass. She is watching a danger go to get reinforcements. Every flag planted in that fort, every beam of timber cut and assembled into those walls, every English name carved into every post, all of it is still there after those sails disappear. All of it is a declaration that does not need a voice to make itself heard. A declaration that says, we have been here, we intend to come back, and when we do, we intend to stay. The film ends at the exact moment when the actual catastrophe begins. It ends at the last possible frame where the story can still be edited into a love story. One more scene, one more year, one more ship arriving, and there is no longer any angle from which this can be presented as anything other than what it is. And here is what the film never tells you happened next. The real young woman who inspired this story did not stand on a cliff and watch her love sail away into a beautiful sunset. A few years after those first encounters, she was captured, taken hostage by English colonists who held her in exchange for political concessions from her father. During her captivity, she was converted to Christianity, given a new name, Rebecca, because her own name, the name her people called her, was considered unsuitable for the life she was now expected to lead. She was then married to an English tobacco planter named John Rolfe, not John Smith, a marriage that historians have long debated in terms of how much meaningful choice she had in it, given the circumstances of captivity and the enormous power imbalance between her position and his. That marriage was presented publicly, both in the Virginia colony and back in England, as a symbol of peaceful coexistence, proof that the colonial project was working, that indigenous people could be integrated and civilized, that the whole enterprise was ultimately benevolent. She and her husband were sent to England, where she was displayed in aristocratic circles almost as a curiosity, as a living demonstration that the Virginia Company's investment was producing results. She was paraded in front of people who looked at her and saw confirmation of their own beliefs about what colonization was supposed to accomplish. And then she got sick. The historians still disagree about exactly what illness took her. Tuberculosis is the most common theory, but whatever it was, she never recovered. She died in England in her early 20s while preparing to board a ship that would have taken her back to her home across the ocean. She never made it back. She died in a country that was not hers, surrounded by people who did not know her, far from the river and the forests and the people she had grown up among. That is the real ending of Pocahontas. Not a cliff, not a sunset, not a swelling orchestral theme. A young woman dying in a foreign country, having had her name taken, her religion changed, her freedom conditional, her story rewritten in her own lifetime by the very people responsible for dismantling the world she came from. And the film could not show you that. It cannot end there, not because the people who made it did not know the history. They had access to the same historical record we do, but because ending there would require the film to ask the audience to sit with something that cannot be resolved into a feeling of hope, something that does not leave you walking out of the theater feeling like love won in the end. The film is a product, and products need to leave their customers satisfied. So they cut it exactly where they did, exactly at the last possible moment of ambiguity, exactly at the frame where the viewer can still choose to believe, if they want to, that everything worked out somehow, that the love mattered enough, that the war being avoided one time was enough. But a war avoided one time is not a war that does not happen. It is a war with a pause button. And in the real history of that land, that pause button was pressed and released over and over again, with each repetition more devastating than the last, until the Powhatan Confederacy that had governed that region for centuries was effectively gone as a political force within a few generations of that first English ship landing on its shore. And here is what makes this film uniquely, specifically American in the way it lies. Because it is not just any entertainment industry that produced this film. It is the American entertainment industry. And America has a particular and very specific relationship with this history because this history happened here. These were not distant foreign lands. This is the ground under the cities and the highways and the suburbs and the national parks. This is the land that became the United States of America. And the story of how it became, that is exactly the story that Pocahontas is telling. Wrapped in a ribbon so beautiful that most people in this country watched it as children and absorbed it as a love story instead of as a creation myth. A creation myth is a story a culture tells itself about how it came to be, and America has several. But one of the most persistent ones is the myth that the encounter between European settlers and indigenous peoples, while perhaps imperfect, was ultimately guided by a possibility of mutual understanding and respect. That men like John Smith existed as a counterweight to men like Ratcliffe, that the story was never simply conquest, never simply extraction, never simply the deliberate and systematic destruction of entire civilizations in service of land acquisition and profit. Pocahontas is the animated version of that myth, and the reason it is so effective as myth is that it is not entirely false. There were individual Europeans who tried to understand indigenous cultures rather than simply dominate them. There were moments of genuine connection across that enormous cultural divide. Those things were real, but they were also completely insufficient to stop what was happening at the structural level. And that is the distinction the film never makes, because making it would collapse the entire romantic premise on which the film depends. You can have genuine love between individuals and still be participating in a system that destroys the people you love. You can have good intentions and still be the mechanism through which catastrophic harm is delivered. You can be John Smith in your heart and still be a Trojan Horse in your function. That is not a comfortable idea. It is not an idea that plays well as the emotional engine of an animated film designed to sell merchandise and soundtrack albums. But it is, arguably, the most important idea that the actual history of this country has to offer anyone willing to look at it honestly. And while we are sitting with that discomfort, let's go back to that final image one more time. Pocahontas on the cliff, the wind, the ship. She is looking at something the film frames as departure, and what it actually is arrival, not of that specific ship, but of everything that ship represents, everything that comes in its wake. The next 100 years of colonial expansion, land acquisition, warfare, treaty making and treaty breaking, displacement, forced relocation, cultural suppression, the outlawing of indigenous languages in schools, the separation of children from families. All of it is already contained as a seed in those sails shrinking on the horizon. She does not know that, and the film makes absolutely certain that you do not know it either in that moment. Because in that moment, they need you to feel what they have been building toward for the entire runtime, the bittersweet beauty of something true and real and meaningful coming to an end. And the tragedy is that something is ending. It is just not the thing they are showing you. What is ending in that shot is not a love story. What is ending in that shot is a world. The world she grew up in, the world her father leads, the world that has its own history and its own future and its own story that has nothing to do with the men who arrived on those ships. That world is ending. Quietly, in the background, behind the romance, behind the music, behind the animation that makes every color more vivid than real life. And that is the most powerful and most insidious thing this film does. It makes the end of a world feel like the end of a date. Before I close this out, drop the like if this hit different than you expected, and tell me in the comments what you actually think of this film now. Did it change anything for you? Or did you already feel like something was off about it every time you watched it? The last thing I will leave you with is this. Every time someone hands you a love story set inside a historical atrocity, your first question should not be whether the love was real. your first question should be, who benefits from you focusing on the love instead of the atrocity? In the case of Pocahontas, the answer to that question is the same answer it has been for 500 years, and it has nothing to do with romance. And maybe that is exactly why, when she stands on that cliff and raises her hand in goodbye, the scene feels so much like grief, even to people who cannot name what they are grieving. Maybe somewhere underneath all that music and all those colors, some part of every person who has ever watched this film already knows that what they are looking at is not a farewell. It is a before.